There is a strange pattern in the oldest stories human beings kept alive. Again and again, the world does not simply continue, it breaks. Water rises where land had been. Fire falls from the sky. A proud city collapses in a night. A people forget the rules that once held order in place, and what follows is not only punishment in the religious sense, but ruin in the material one. Drowned fields, broken walls, ash in the air, silence where voices had been. The myths differ in language, in gods, in landscape, in moral tone, yet their emotional shape can feel disturbingly familiar. They remember a threshold crossed and the cost of crossing it. For a long time, educated societies tended to place such tales in a separate chamber of thought. Myth belonged to poetry, ritual, symbol. History belonged to dates, inscriptions, pottery, bones. One spoke in images, the other in evidence. That distinction still matters, and it matters for good reason. Myths are not archives in the modern sense. They fold centuries together. They turn memory into story and fear into pattern. They explain suffering through gods, monsters, ancestors, laws, and sacred transgression. They should not be forced into literal readings they were never meant to bear. And yet, the old division has never been perfectly clean. Beneath the symbolic language, myths often cling to physical things: a shoreline, a mountain, a city wall, a river that changed course, a sea that moved farther inland than anyone expected. The oldest stories were not written by detached observers. They were carried by people whose lives were exposed to flood, drought, earthquake, famine, migration, disease, and war. They did not inherit safety as a default condition. They inherited vulnerability and then built meaning around it. Somewhere in southern Mesopotamia, in the long alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates, the ground itself offers a quiet beginning to this problem. The first cities of Sumer rose in a landscape that was both generous and unstable. Water made life possible there. Water also threatened it. Irrigation channels could feed thousands, but a river in spate could erase boundaries in a matter of hours. Settlements were rebuilt again and again in mud brick, that most practical and fragile material, always returning to the same exposed earth. In such a world, memory did not need to invent disaster. Disaster was already part of ordinary reality. It is no surprise that Mesopotamian literature preserved some of the most famous flood traditions in human history. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim survives a deluge sent by the gods, carrying life through annihilation in a carefully built vessel. In the older Atrahasis tradition, the flood comes after divine frustration with humankind. These are theological stories, moral stories, cosmological stories. But they are also stories born in a floodplain. They emerged from generations who knew that the line between fertility and destruction could be as thin as a riverbank after rain. The same tension appears elsewhere, though never in quite the same form. Greek memory preserved the flood of Deucalion. In South Asia, later Sanskrit tradition told of Manu warned by a fish before the waters came. In parts of the Americas and Oceania, there are also inherited stories of great inundation, though their forms, dates, and meanings vary enormously and should not be forced into a single global event. That temptation has often been strong. It remains stronger than the evidence. The archaeological record does not support one universal flood remembered equally by all peoples. The record is more difficult than that and more human. What it does suggest, in many places, is that the end of the last ice age transformed coastlines, estuaries, wetlands, and human habitations on a scale almost impossible for settled modern minds to feel from day to day. Between roughly 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, global sea levels rose by more than 100 meters as great ice sheets melted, not all at once, not as a single wall of water, but steadily, unevenly, sometimes with pulses, sometimes with local violence. Lands that had once been walked disappeared beneath continental shelves. River valleys became seabeds, campsites, seasonal routes, hunting grounds, and perhaps places of ritual were swallowed so completely that their absence can now feel natural, even though it was once catastrophic. This is where the silence begins to deepen. So much of early human life took place near water. Coasts offered food, transport, shelter, and movement. Yet the evidence for those ancient literal worlds is often missing, not because people were absent, but because the sea now lies over them. What remains is inland. What vanished may have been central. The record, in that sense, has a geographic wound. A small thing can carry the weight of that wound. A worked stone dredged from a submerged bank, a drowned forest exposed at low tide, a fishhook from a shore that no longer exists. These are not myths, they are fragments. But fragments have a way of changing the atmosphere around old stories. They do not prove the legends true in any simple sense. They do something quieter. They remind us that many ancestral worlds really did disappear, and that those who watched them go had no obligation to remember the loss in modern prose. Perhaps that is why the oldest warnings rarely sound like technical reports. They sound like grief arranged into narrative. And once that possibility enters the mind, the old tales begin to feel less distant, not confirmed, not decoded, but newly alive, as if they were standing at the edge of history, pointing not toward fantasy, but toward a broken memory too large to keep whole. To understand how a warning enters myth, it helps to imagine the scale at which human memory once operated. Not the memory of libraries, states, or inscriptions carved for permanence, but the memory of families, singers, elders, navigators, ritual keepers. A coastline could change over generations, slowly enough that each loss seemed survivable, and yet fast enough that grandchildren stood where grandparents had hunted and saw only water. A river mouth could widen. A barrier island could fail in a storm. Salt could enter low fields that once grew reeds or grain. No single witness needed to see the whole transformation, for the transformation to become sacred memory. Modern research has made this possibility harder to dismiss lightly. Around the world, archaeologists and paleoenvironmental researchers have reconstructed drowned landscapes that were once habitable. The North Sea basin, now hidden beneath cold water and shipping lanes, once included a broad plain that scholars often call Doggerland. During parts of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, it linked what are now Britain and continental Europe through marshes, rivers, lakes, and hunting grounds. Tools, animal remains, and environmental reconstructions suggest a real human world there. That world did not vanish in one mythic instant. It contracted as the sea advanced. In places, the process was gradual. In others, sudden events may have intensified the loss. The Storegga submarine landslide off the coast of Norway around 6,200 BCE likely triggered a massive tsunami that affected parts of the North Atlantic. Some researchers have wondered whether communities already living with rising seas experienced moments like that as unforgettable ruptures. The evidence is fragmentary here, and caution matters. A tsunami deposit is not a legend. A legend is not a dated sediment layer. But when one places the two beside each other, not to force agreement, but to allow resonance, something revealing occurs. The old stories begin to read less like naive explanations and more like cultural forms built to carry danger forward. Not exact reports, durable warnings. In northern Australia, researchers have drawn attention to Aboriginal oral traditions that may preserve memories of coastlines inundated thousands of years ago. Some accounts describe places once occupied by ancestors now beneath the sea, or changes in shorelines remembered through story. Dating the continuity of oral tradition across such immense spans is difficult, and scholars debate how confidently particular narratives can be linked to post-glacial sea level rise. Still, the possibility itself is astonishing. It suggests that under the right cultural conditions, human communities can preserve meaningful environmental memory far longer than literate societies once assumed. This matters because modern people are trained to think of myth as the opposite of precision, but oral cultures often stored knowledge differently, not carelessly. Memory could be embedded in sacred geography, kinship, taboo, seasonal movement, and story. A tale about an ancestor crossing a bay where land once stood might also function as an encoded relation to place. A prohibition attached to a river mouth might preserve ecological intelligence. A songline might be at once cosmological and practical, spiritual and navigational. The categories later scholars separated were not always separate in lived tradition. There is a temptation here to romanticize indigenous memory as somehow pure, untouched, or superhuman. That, too, would distort the past. Oral traditions change. They absorb new realities. They shift under pressure. They are interpreted and reinterpreted. But their flexibility may be part of their strength. A written line fixed in a dead language can survive materially while becoming opaque. A spoken story can alter in wording and remain alive in function. It can keep carrying a caution, even when the original event is no longer fully understood. The small detail, again, matters. On a now submerged shelf, there may once have been a freshwater spring known to generations. Along a retreating coast, a stand of trees may have marked the safe crossing before the tide turned treacherous. In a cave above an ancient shoreline, smoke may have stained the ceiling while children listened to elders name the dangers below. When the water rose higher, the story would rise with it, leaving the place behind, but not the warning attached to it. The farther back one goes, the more the record thins. Human beings were already symbol-making, ritual-bearing, world-interpreting creatures long before they built cities or kept chronicles. The end of the Ice Age did not only redraw maps, it may also have trained entire populations to think historically through loss. To live in a world where familiar ground could disappear was to inherit a deep lesson about impermanence, even if that lesson was spoken in the voices of gods and beasts. And perhaps this is one reason so many myths begin after a breaking point rather than before one. The survivors emerge onto a changed earth, a new shore, a mountain peak, a stranded vessel, a handful of kin. The old world has gone under, and what remains is not confidence, but instruction. Build, differently. Remember differently. Respect the boundary this time. Somewhere between environmental memory and sacred narration, a pattern took root. Not every myth was born from catastrophe, but many seem to know with unnerving intimacy that stability is temporary, and that forgetting this may be one of the oldest human mistakes. Water is only one kind of warning. In many ancient traditions, the danger comes not from the sea, but from the sky, the mountain, the fault beneath the feet. A people may live for centuries in apparent continuity, farming the same valley, rebuilding the same shrine, burying their dead in familiar ground, and then a day arrives when the earth behaves like something alive and offended. The warning preserved in myth is not always that disaster happened once. It is that the world itself was never as stable as it seemed. Few landscapes show this more clearly than the eastern Mediterranean in the second millennium BCE. Here, islands and coasts were linked by trade, seafaring, craft production, and ceremonial exchange. Copper moved, tin moved, pottery styles traveled, ideas crossed water, along with merchants and sailors. This was not a quiet world, but it was a connected one, and connected worlds have their own kind of fragility. They depend on rhythms holding. Winds being favorable enough, harvests sufficient. Ports open, alliances intact, one disrupted node can be endured. Enough disruptions at once begin to feel like fate. At Akrotiri on the island of Thera, buried under volcanic ash, that fragility seems to pause in material form. The settlement, often associated with the wider Minoan sphere, preserves streets, buildings, frescoes, storage jars, staircases, and traces of a sophisticated Bronze Age community. It is one of those sites where absence becomes as eloquent as survival. Walls remain, paint remains, rooms remain. Yet many human bodies are missing, suggesting evacuation before the final eruption, or at least before the deadliest phase of it. What vanished was not simply architecture, it was the flow of life through the architecture, the hands on door frames, the baskets carried upstairs, the voices between rooms, the routines interrupted and never resumed. The eruption of Thera, usually dated to the late 17th or early 16th century BCE, was one of the most powerful volcanic events in human prehistory. Its exact historical effects remain debated. Some researchers argue for major regional disruption, including tsunamis and damage to Minoan centers on Crete. Others remain more cautious about direct causal chains. The archaeological and chronological debates are complex, and certainty grows thin at key points. But no one doubts the scale of the eruption itself. Ash traveled far, the sea was disturbed, the sky darkened. A prosperous maritime world would have felt its consequences. It is not difficult to see how such events could become mythic material, though not as simple memory capsules waiting to be decoded. Greek traditions later told of Atlantis, a powerful island civilization that flourished and then vanished beneath the sea in a single terrible interval. Plato's account is a philosophical narrative, shaped by moral and political purposes, and most scholars do not regard it as a direct historical record of Thera or any one catastrophe. Still, the endurance of the motif is revealing. Great islands do disappear in cultural imagination. Sea power does end. Splendor can become a cautionary tale. The same is true farther east and south, where storm gods, dragon slayers, and mountain deities often stand near tectonic realities. In the ancient Near East, divine combat myths sometimes turned on the taming of chaotic waters or the maintenance of order against forces always threatening return. These are cosmological structures, not weather bulletins, yet they emerge in environments where flood, drought, and political collapse were lived facts. To speak of order as fragile was not abstraction. It was daily observation raised to sacred scale. A broken wall can sometimes say more than a legend. At sites affected by earthquakes, archaeologists may find collapsed masonry, shifted foundations, repairs layered over damage. A city does not need to vanish entirely to remember disaster. It can continue after rupture, carrying the scar in rebuilt streets and altered habit. This may be closer to how many communities truly experienced warning, not as total extinction, but as recurrent proof that continuity must be constantly remade. There is tenderness in that thought. Ancient people did not only fear disaster, they labored after it. They patched roofs, recut stones, redug wells, re-sanctified temples. Myth in such settings may preserve not only the terror of collapse, but the discipline of survival. A story about divine anger or cosmic disorder could also be a way of telling descendants, the world can fail suddenly. Rebuild with humility. Somewhere on a harbor edge after a seismic wave, a child may have found fish flung onto mud where boats once floated. Somewhere after falling ash, a mother may have wrapped cloth over a face and led her family inland through dim light. Somewhere in a palace archive later burned or abandoned, scribes may have tried to account for losses already too large for inventory. Those human moments rarely survive in direct form. What remains are the traces and the stories. One speaks in sediment and stone, the other in image and moral pattern. Together they suggest that ancient warnings were not always about one event. Sometimes they were about living in the shadow of recurrence, knowing the ground beneath order was never entirely secure. If flood and fire taught one kind of caution, the fall of cities taught another. A community could survive rising water or a violent season and still believe that walls, grain stores, kingship, and ritual would hold the human world in place. Then, across the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, many of those assurances began to fail at once. Palaces burned, trade routes fractured, writing systems disappeared from use in some regions, long-distance exchange narrowed. Some settlements were abandoned, others shrank. The old order did not vanish everywhere in the same way, and scholars continue to debate the relative force of drought, war, internal unrest, migration, earthquakes, and cascading systems failure. But the pattern is clear enough to feel unsettling even now. Complexity did not guarantee endurance. There is a tendency in modern imagination to picture collapse as theatrical, a single night of flames visible from every hilltop. Sometimes fire did come. Burn layers are real. But more often the ending of a world is stretched across years, then compressed by memory into a form the mind can carry. A harbor silts up, grain arrives late, mercenaries are not paid, a court loses reach over outlying towns, scribes continue writing for a while, then stop. A generation later, the children no longer know the old script, and what once seemed permanent becomes mute. At Hattusa, the Hittite capital in central Anatolia, monumental gates, fortifications, temples, and administrative buildings once anchored one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age. The state negotiated with Egypt, fought wars, managed vassals, and maintained archives on clay tablets. Then, in the turmoil around the early 12th century BCE, the imperial structure dissolved. The city was eventually abandoned. The reasons remain debated, and no single explanation satisfies every piece of evidence. Climate pressure may have mattered. So may conflict and political fragmentation. What matters here is not the temptation to solve the collapse with one neat cause, but the human fact that even literate, bureaucratic, militarized states can pass beneath a horizon of recoverability. Something similar hangs over Mycenaean Greece, though again the sequence varies from place to place. Palace centers such as Pylos and Mycenae were damaged or destroyed. Linear B administration disappeared. Population patterns shifted. Networks once tied to elite redistribution broke down. In the generations that followed, memory did not vanish, but it changed its medium. By the time Greek epic emerged in written form centuries later, the old palace world had been transformed into something half-remembered, half-reimagined. Heroes, bronze, voyages, sieges, ancestral splendor, and grief. The distance between archaeology and epic is real. Homer is not a documentary witness to the 13th century BCE, but the poems do preserve a profound awareness that worlds can end and remain only as song. This may be one of myth's deepest functions, not to preserve events with modern fidelity, but to carry the emotional truth of civilizational rupture after the administrative truth has failed. Archives burn. Oral memory survives in altered form. A destroyed citadel becomes the house of a cursed king. A generation of scarcity becomes an age of wandering. Trade disruption becomes a story about a strange peoples and angry gods. What has been lost is not only information. It is the original frame in which the information made sense. A broken storage jar in a palace magazine can open that whole abyss. Grain once meant taxes, rations, feasts, offerings, political legitimacy. When the jar breaks in the final destruction layer, it is not merely ceramic damage. It is a tiny sign that distribution failed, that the choreography of power and subsistence faltered. And for the people living through it, the warning may not have been abstract at all. It may have felt like less bread, fewer guards on the road, more rumors at the gate, more strangers moving with hunger behind them. Some ancient traditions remembered these pressures as moral decline, others as divine abandonment, others as heroic age followed by diminishment. Hesiod, writing in archaic Greece, imagined successive ages of humankind descending away from an earlier order, including a heroic age already touched by loss. Such schemes are mythic and ethical, not archaeological chronologies. Yet they preserve a sensation that history can move downward as well as upward. That memory itself may stand on the far side of a break. This is larger than it first seemed because city collapse is never only urban. When institutions fail, villages change, roads empty, craft traditions scatter, local ecologies shift, and the dead may no longer be buried with the same care or symbols. The warning stored in these old narratives may be less about apocalypse in the absolute sense than about interdependence. A civilization is not a monument. It is a living mesh of labor, climate, trust, violence, belief, and habit. Once enough strands fray together, people turn to story not because they are irrational, but because story can hold the shape of a loss too wide for a ledger. And from those darkened thresholds, another category of warning slowly emerges. not from the collapse of cities alone, but from the collapse of meaning itself, when language remains, and yet the old world can no longer be read. There are moments in the human past when the warning is not that the city burned or the shoreline vanished, but that the signs remained and no one could fully understand them anymore. A script falls out of use. A ritual phrase survives after its grammar has become strange. A sacred image is repeated long after the world that gave it meaning has changed. In such moments, loss becomes quieter and perhaps more unsettling. It is possible to inherit the shell of memory while losing access to its interior. The ancient world is full of these half-lit inheritances. In Bronze Age Crete, the script modern scholars call Linear A still resists full decipherment. It appears on tablets, libation tables, and objects tied to administration and ritual, yet the language behind it remains uncertain. It is not an empty mystery for the sake of atmosphere. It is a concrete limit in the record. A literate society once wrote things that mattered enough to inscribe and preserve, and now the signs can be seen while the voices behind them remain out of reach. What remains is form. What vanished is comprehension. Why that absence matters is simple and profound. Without understanding the language, an entire layer of thought is present before us, and still withheld. This happens on other scales as well. In Egypt, where writing endured with remarkable continuity across millennia, later generations still had to reinterpret older forms of the past. Ruins gathered around them like inherited mountains of stone. Temples were restored, reinscribed, reused, and reimagined. Kings linked themselves to earlier kings. Priests handled traditions that were ancient, even by their own standards. Continuity here was real, but it was never perfect sameness. Each age received a past already worn by time. Even one of the longest-lived literate civilizations on Earth had to negotiate what could be carried forward and what had already become sacred distance. This is one reason myth and warning intertwine so deeply. A culture does not wait until everything is forgotten before it begins turning memory into symbol. The transformation starts much earlier. An old catastrophe becomes attached to a god. A lost migration route becomes a tale of wandering heroes. A political rupture becomes a story of divine succession. The aim is not deception. It is preservation under pressure. Symbolic language can outlast precise explanation because it is more portable, more adaptable, and more durable in communities that must survive change. A small object can reveal this process with painful clarity. A seal impression broken from its original document, a shard bearing a few incised signs, a reused stone carved with a name no later mason could read. These are not dramatic in the way a collapsed citadel or flooded plain is dramatic. They are intimate losses. They suggest that human beings often live among the remains of meanings already fading. One generation uses a sign naturally. A later generation reveres it. A later one copies it. Another mistakes it. Then, after enough time, scholars kneel beside it and admit the record grows thin. The warning embedded in such material is subtle. It says that forgetting does not begin when the archive disappears. Forgetting begins inside continuity itself. It begins when people still perform inherited acts, but no longer know the full world those acts once answered to. Some religious traditions preserve this tension openly. Hymns repeat ancient formulas. Ceremonies retain gestures older than their current explanations. Sacred places remain active while their deepest beginnings are uncertain. This is not failure. It may be one of the normal conditions of civilization. And yet it carries a certain sadness. Imagine a temple singer reciting words learned flawlessly, not knowing that some phrase at the center of the chant belonged to a vanished river cult, or a forgotten migration, or an old alliance between peoples whose names no longer travel together. Imagine a child tracing a symbol on stone because adults say it is holy, without any way of entering the first fear or hope that made it sacred. The chain is unbroken in one sense and broken in another. Some researchers, especially in the study of oral poetry, ritual language, and long-duration tradition, have shown how conservatively certain forms can endure even as their contexts shift. Others stress how much reinvention occurs beneath the appearance of continuity. Both are likely true. Human cultures are neither faithful recording machines nor careless improvisers. They are living systems under pressure, trying to keep something essential alive while constantly translating it into new circumstances. This may be why ancient myths so often feel layered, as if several different ages are speaking through the same story at once. A flood tale may contain environmental memory, moral teaching, political theology, and ritual pattern all braided together. A descent into the underworld may echo seasonal cycles, grief practices, kingship ideology, and personal fear of death. A warning, once taken into myth, rarely remains single. It gathers meanings the way an old road gathers footsteps. And perhaps that is one of the most human truths hidden in these inherited stories. The ancestors did not always know exactly what they were preserving. They knew only that some things must not be dropped, even if their original shape was already slipping away. So they carried them in song, in stone, in ceremony, in names. Long after the first occasion had vanished, the burden remained, not as certainty, but as obligation. And from that obligation, another warning begins to emerge, that the greatest civilizational losses are not only the things destroyed by force or flood, but the meanings that survive in fragments, while the worlds that once made them legible recede into darkness. One of the oldest warnings human beings ever received may have come not from kings, priests, or poets, but from the sky itself. Long before cities, before bronze, before writing, before monumental walls, small bands of hunter-gatherers lived in a world shaped by cold, migration, scarcity, and close attention. They watched animal movement, seasonal light, the behavior of rivers, the smell of distant rain. They also lived beneath a night sky far less dimmed than any modern one. When something unusual appeared there, it would not have been background. It would have entered the body first as fear. The deep human past leaves very few direct traces of feeling. A stone blade can show skill, a burial can show care, pigment can show symbolism, but terror, awe, and inherited caution are harder to recover. Even so, some prehistoric sites suggest that the people who made them were not only surviving environments, they were interpreting forces larger than themselves, weaving danger into cosmology. At Göbekli Tepe, in southeastern Anatolia, monumental T-shaped pillars were raised by communities living before the widespread adoption of farming in the 10th millennium BCE. Carved animals move across the stone: foxes, snakes, boars, birds, scorpions. The site has inspired a great deal of speculation, much of it unwarranted. It should not be turned into a blank screen for modern fantasies. What matters historically is already astonishing enough. Here were people still often described too lazily as simple foragers, organizing labor, shaping limestone, and building ceremonial architecture of enormous symbolic weight. The site suggests complex social worlds, ritual gathering, and a cognitive depth that modern stereotypes long denied to early humans. What exactly the imagery meant remains unresolved. Some researchers emphasize feasting, social cohesion, and ritual performance. Others explore the iconography more cautiously, noting recurring dangerous animals and the possibility that the site engaged with mortality, threat, and the unstable boundary between human order and wild power. The evidence does not allow easy certainty, but the emotional register of the carvings is hard to ignore. These are not soft, decorative scenes. They feel alert, charged. The stone remembers tension. Nearby sites of the same broad cultural world, including Karahan Tepe and others in the region, deepen the impression that early Holocene communities were building symbolic landscapes, not merely shelters or storage. This was an age of environmental transition. The Pleistocene was ending. Climate regimes were shifting. Large game patterns changed. Human groups were experimenting with new forms of gathering and perhaps new social stresses. In such a setting, warning may have been less about one catastrophe than about how to inhabit a changing world without losing coherence. A skull can sometimes hold this whole question. At various prehistoric sites, evidence of skull removal, plastering, curation, or ritual treatment suggests a persistent engagement with the dead that was intimate and structured. The ancestors were not simply gone, they remained socially present. This matters because myths are often treated as explanations of nature alone, when in fact they also regulate relations between living people, dead kin, dangerous animals, sacred places, and uncertain futures. A warning in myth may say, "Remember the flood," but it may also say, "Remember who you are when the world becomes unstable." The Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt climatic cooling beginning around 12,900 years ago, has often been drawn into dramatic narratives about civilizational destruction. Some of those claims go beyond the evidence. Debates continue over causes, regional effects, and broader cultural implications. What can be said with confidence is that late Pleistocene and early Holocene communities lived through significant environmental shifts over long stretches of time. They adapted, moved, changed subsistence strategies, and reconfigured symbolic worlds. The lesson here is not that one vanished supercivilization encoded its fate into myth. The lesson is more demanding. Human beings, much earlier than once imagined, were already processing instability at scale. Perhaps that is why the oldest sacred places feel so serious. Not gloomy exactly, serious. Their builders seem to have known that life depended on more than food alone. It depended on shared meaning, strong enough to bind groups through uncertainty. The warning was therefore social as much as natural. A people who lose their stories of orientation may be as vulnerable as a people who lose fresh water. Somewhere in the twilight, around one of those stone enclosures, firelight may have moved across carved predators, while voices repeated names, rules, lineages, dangers. Somewhere, a child may have learned not only what animals hunted in the dark, but what invisible boundaries must not be crossed in the human world. We do not know the words. We may never know them. Yet the architecture suggests urgency. These communities built as if memory itself needed a house, And that possibility changes the scale of the question again. The warning was not only about floodplain, volcano, or fallen palace. It may also have been about the fragility of human order in the face of a world older, colder, and less forgiving than any myth could fully describe. The farther back one looks, the less childish the ancestors appear. They begin to seem like people standing very near the raw edge of uncertainty, already doing what later civilizations would also do, turning danger into form, and form into something strong enough to carry forward through the dark. If the oldest warnings were carried in ritual and landscape, later civilizations often placed them inside genealogies of power. The danger was no longer only flood, famine, or the terror of the wild. It was pride at the scale of kingdoms. It was the belief that order, once achieved, belonged permanently to those who held it. Again and again, ancient literature returns to this tension. A ruler expands too far, a city grows rich and forgets its limits. An empire mistakes reach for permanence. Then the warning arrives, not always as sudden annihilation, but as reversal. Mesopotamia understood this with unusual clarity because it had watched cities rise and fall for thousands of years. Uruk, Ur, Akkad, Babylon, Nineveh, each became, in different ages, a center of human ambition. Each also entered the shadow of loss. Some survive as names in later tradition, more vividly than as living continuities. Others remain archaeologically immense and historically broken. Between the baked mud brick, the inscribed tablets, and the royal boasts, one can feel a recurring problem. Political power always tried to speak in the grammar of eternity. The ground answered in erosion. Take Akkad, the empire associated with Sargon and his successors in the late 3rd millennium BCE. Its historical importance was immense. It linked regions, projected military power, and helped establish a model of kingship that later polities would remember and imitate. Yet the city of Akkad itself has never been securely identified in the archaeological record. This absence is one of those peculiar historical wounds that quietly rearrange the imagination. A state that dominated memory could leave behind a capital still uncertain in place. What remains are inscriptions, echoes, ideological forms. What vanished is the actual urban center from which so much authority radiated. Why the absence matters is not only scholarly. It reminds us that fame in text does not guarantee survival in earth. Later Mesopotamian compositions, including laments over destroyed cities, preserve this instability in deeply emotional form. The city laments of Sumer are among the most moving survivals of the ancient world. They speak of abandoned sanctuaries, scattered people, broken walls, and divine withdrawal. These are liturgical and theological works, not neutral reportage. Yet they are also cultural responses to real episodes of devastation. A city falls, and the community must explain not only material ruin, but metaphysical disorientation. Why did order fail? Why were the gods silent, or worse, complicit? The lament becomes a vessel for civic grief. This is where warning takes on a moral timbre without becoming simplistic. Ancient peoples often understood disaster through ethics because ethics was one of the few frameworks large enough to hold collective suffering. A famine could be described as failed ritual, bad kingship, divine anger, social disorder, or cosmic imbalance. Modern readers may resist those explanations, and often rightly. But beneath them lies something recognizable. the intuition that systems decay when obligations are neglected. That intuition is not unhistorical. It is one way human beings perceive fragility before they can model it analytically. A cracked foundation brick can hold that whole drama. In royal inscriptions, kings often announced that they rebuilt what earlier rulers founded, restoring temples and walls as acts of piety and legitimacy. Yet every rebuilding also confesses prior damage. Time, war, weather, neglect. Something had weakened the structure. The brick survives because a later hand touched it, reused it, reinscribed the memory of repair. Civilization, seen from that angle, is less a triumphal ascent than an endless labor against unmaking. Elsewhere, the pattern repeats in different language. The Hebrew Bible, shaped through long centuries of composition, preservation, exile, and reinterpretation, frequently frames catastrophe as covenantal warning. Cities fall, kingdoms fracture, peoples are uprooted. Here again, one must be careful. These texts are theological and literary works with their own internal purposes, not transparent chronicle. Yet they emerged from communities who knew conquest, deportation, and imperial pressure intimately. The warnings they preserve are not abstractions. They are rooted in the real experience that political order can collapse, and that memory must survive displacement. This is larger than it first seemed because imperial warning is never only for rulers. When a kingdom breaks, ordinary lives absorb the cost. Farmers lose fields, craftspeople lose markets, families are moved or scattered, sacred calendars are interrupted, burial grounds are left behind. A child grows up hearing that the old city was magnificent, but sees only ruins or foreign administration. Myth enters here not as escape from history, but as a language capable of carrying broken belonging across generations. One can imagine an old woman in exile handling a seal, a household figurine, a shard of painted pottery, some small remnant from a city no longer reachable. For her, the warning would not be about abstract hubris alone. It would be about the unbearable fact that worlds can disappear while the people who love them remain alive. The stories told around such remnants would naturally gather moral force. They would teach caution, humility, fidelity, endurance. But beneath all of that, they would preserve a more fragile truth, that every civilization imagines itself central until it becomes memory in the mouths of the displaced, and that perhaps the oldest political myths were trying in their own grave way to teach descendants how thin the line is between glory and ash. Warnings also gather around hunger, not the ceremonial hunger of fasting or the symbolic hunger of desire, but the plain, relentless kind that changes the body first and then the mind. Ancient myths do not always describe famine directly. Sometimes they speak instead of barren lands, offended gods, withheld fertility, wandering peoples, blighted seasons, or a king whose failure has spread upward into the sky and downward into the soil. Yet beneath those sacred forms lies one of the most enduring conditions of human vulnerability. Civilizations were never only threatened by armies or floods. They were threatened by the possibility that the earth, for reasons natural or social or both, would cease to yield enough. In the ancient Near East and Eastern Mediterranean, this danger was constant, even in prosperous ages. Grain surpluses could support palaces, labor specialization, armies, temples, and long-distance exchange. But such systems depended on harvest reliability within a narrow margin. A few weak seasons, especially when combined with conflict or political rigidity, could destabilize entire regions. Climate records from lake sediments, cave deposits, pollen data, and other proxies suggest that periods of aridity and environmental stress intersected with several moments of upheaval in antiquity, including the disruptions around the end of the Late Bronze Age. The exact causal weight remains debated. Climate does not act alone. Human institutions mediate suffering, distribute risk, and sometimes magnify it. Still, the old myths were right to treat fertility as precarious. It was. This is one reason agricultural deities and seasonal descent narratives appear with such emotional force. In Mesopotamia, the descent of Inanna and associated traditions around Dumuzi engage mortality, kingship, fertility, and the instability of life-giving order. In the Greek world, the story of Demeter and Persephone binds grief, agriculture, seasonal return, and the pain of separation into one of the central myths of the ancient Mediterranean. No serious reading turns these stories into weather manuals. They are richer than that. But neither should their agricultural setting be flattened into decoration. Communities depending on grain, herds, and seasonal rhythm did not encounter fertility as metaphor alone. When crops failed, myth and survival converged. A field can hold a warning as powerfully as a temple. Soil exhausted by overuse, salinized by irrigation, stripped by erosion, or left vulnerable to drought becomes more than an environmental condition. It becomes a civilizational pressure point. In southern Mesopotamia, scholars have long discussed salinization and its possible role in shaping agricultural challenges over time. The details are complex and regionally uneven, and older explanations were sometimes too linear. Yet the broader truth remains. Intensive human systems often carry ecological costs that accumulate slowly and then become difficult to ignore. Ancient people did not always possess our vocabulary for sustainability, but many knew intimately that land could be damaged by the way it was worked. That knowledge often entered culture through warning forms rather than technical prose. A neglected right, a broken covenant, a king's injustice, a violated taboo, these could all serve as languages for describing imbalance. To modern ears, such explanations may sound superstitious, yet they perform a subtle cultural task. They insist that subsistence cannot be separated from conduct. The moral frame may not satisfy scientific analysis, but it recognizes something real. A society's habits, hierarchies, and blind spots shape how environmental stress is felt and whether it becomes catastrophe. The small detail here might be a charred grain kernel, preserved in a destruction layer. Archaeobotanists can study such remains to reconstruct crops, storage, processing, and dietary patterns. A single burned seed can reveal what was being grown, what was being eaten, what kind of economy sustained a household or a town. It can also hint at sudden ending. Fire took the storehouse before the grain could be consumed. The harvest turned from sustenance into evidence. That quiet reversal feels almost mythic in itself. Human beings living near the edge of shortage often become acutely attentive to signs, the timing of birds, the smell of rain, the level of a river against a known stone, the flowering of a tree. Such attentiveness is practical, but it also shapes mentality. The world becomes legible through thresholds and omens because survival depends on reading slight changes correctly. Myths born in agrarian settings may therefore preserve not just symbolic narratives of divine absence or return, but the sensory discipline of people trained by necessity to notice instability before it becomes visible to everyone. Somewhere in a village facing a failed season, an old story would have sounded newly urgent. Not because listeners believed every image literally, but because the story already knew the emotion gathering in the body. The fear that order had withdrawn, that something essential had gone out of relation, a mother measuring grain more carefully than usual, a father scanning a hard sky, children told to eat slowly, priests offering more fervently, officials growing tense, rumors traveling faster than caravans. In such conditions, warning is no luxury. It becomes a way of preserving social attention. And perhaps that is why so many ancient traditions tie nourishment to reverence, memory, and restraint. Hunger teaches scale brutally. It reminds a civilization that its grandeur stands on fragile metabolic foundations: seed, rain, labor, storage, fairness, peace. When myths warn of offended fertility or broken seasonal order, they may not be predicting collapse in a modern predictive sense. They may be doing something older and wiser. They may be teaching that abundance is never self-explanatory, and that the deepest human disasters often begin long before the famine is visible, in the quiet accumulation of habits that forget how dependent every city is on the thin living skin of the earth. There is another kind of warning that ancient myths carry with particular persistence, and it concerns not the land beneath a people, but the strangers beyond the horizon. Long before the modern language of borders and geopolitics, human communities understood that danger often arrived wearing a human face. Raiders, migrants, emissaries, traders, mercenaries, displaced families, rival kingdoms, wandering bands after drought or war, these figures recur throughout the ancient record. Sometimes they bring exchange and renewal. Sometimes they bring pressure, infection, violence, or profound change. More often, they bring all of these at once. Myths preserve this ambiguity with unusual honesty. The outsider is rarely simple. In heroic and foundation traditions, the arrival of strangers can feel almost fated. A ship lands. A wandering ancestor enters a valley. A foreign bride crosses into a royal house. A guest is welcomed or not welcomed, and from that encounter, a city's future unfolds. These stories are deeply literary and symbolic, but they also emerge from a world in which mobility was constant. Ancient societies were never sealed containers. People moved because of trade, marriage, exile, war, seasonal necessity, ecological stress, and ambition. Cultural boundaries were real yet porous. Identity itself was often formed in relation to who came from elsewhere. Archaeology has made this harder to ignore. Isotopic analysis of human remains can sometimes reveal that an individual did not grow up where they were buried. Ancient DNA has illuminated large-scale population movements across Eurasia, while also showing how complex admixture and local continuity could coexist. Linguistic evidence, too, preserves deep histories of migration, contact, and borrowing. None of this supports crude racial myths or simplistic invasion fantasies. The story is not one of pure people suddenly replaced by others. It is far more intricate. Human worlds were repeatedly reshaped by movement, often unevenly and over long spans of time. The myths knew this, though they expressed it differently. Consider the many traditions in which civilization itself is attributed to a bringer from elsewhere, a culture hero, a founding king, a divine teacher, a stranger with skills. Such figures may reflect the prestige of foreign knowledge, the memory of contact, or the felt strangeness of innovations arriving from beyond the familiar. But ancient stories also encode the fear that outsiders disturb moral and ritual order. In Greek literature, Xenia, the ethics of hospitality, sits under constant tension because receiving the stranger is both sacred duty and real risk. To welcome wrongly is dangerous. To refuse wrongly is also dangerous. The warning lies in the threshold. This threshold mattered materially as well. Trade routes enriched cities, but also exposed them. Ports opened channels for goods, ideas, and political dependence. Frontier zones generated hybrid cultures, yet remained vulnerable to conflict. In periods of ecological or political stress, movements of people could become especially destabilizing. Around the end of the Late Bronze Age, inscriptions from Egypt refer to groups conventionally labeled the Sea Peoples. Their identities, origins, and roles remain heavily debated. They were likely not a single unified nation descending from nowhere, but a mixed and shifting phenomenon connected to the larger instability of the age. Even so, their appearance in the record reveals how ancient states experienced mobile, armed populations, not just as military threat, but as a sign that the old order was failing to hold. A single buried skeleton can make this feel immediate. A body interred with grave goods unlike those typical of the surrounding region. A healed injury suggesting prior violence. Teeth whose isotopes indicate a childhood spent elsewhere. Such details do not tell a story by themselves, but they open one. A woman married across distance, a captive taken and absorbed, a craftsperson moving toward opportunity, a refugee crossing into survival. The ancient world was full of such lives, though elite texts often reduce them to categories: barbarian, foreigner, captive, ally, invader. Myth sometimes repairs that flattening by giving the outsider emotional depth, even when that depth remains morally charged. The wanderer is dangerous because he carries another world within him. The foreign queen is feared because alliance and contamination cannot be neatly separated. The guest may be god or murderer. The exiled child may return as founder or destroyer. These are not accidental narrative habits. They belong to societies where human movement repeatedly altered the balance of memory, custom, and power. This is larger than it first seemed because movement is not only a threat from outside, it is often the hidden condition of what later becomes tradition. Many peoples preserve origin stories of journey, exile, crossing, or emergence. Some are symbolic, some may dimly echo real migrations. Most are both more and less historical than they appear. They do not provide maps in the modern sense, but they keep alive the knowledge that belonging had to be made, often after displacement. A settled people may still carry a migratory memory in its sacred stories long after the trail itself is forgotten. One can imagine a family arriving at dusk in a place where their grandchildren will later insist they have always been. The adults would know otherwise. They would remember the road, the dead left behind, the different language of the last valley the river crossed in fear. Their children might inherit only fragments of that memory. Their descendants might transform it into myth. A god led us, a hero founded us, a monster blocked the way, a sea opened, a mountain chose us. Beneath the sacred pattern there may still lie a human warning. People move when worlds become untenable, and each movement remakes both those who arrive and those who receive them. Ancient myths, in their careful unease around strangers, seem to remember this better than many settled civilizations ever wish to admit. Some warnings are preserved not in the story of what happened, but in the story of what must never be built again. Again and again, in the ancient imagination, human beings cross a line of scale. They gather too much power in one place. They seek heaven by construction. They harden hierarchy until it begins to resemble the order of the gods. Then something intervenes. Language breaks, the tower fails, the city is scattered, the ruler is struck low, the monument becomes a ruin, speaking against the ambition that raised it. These stories are often treated as moral allegories, and of course they are. But they also emerge from real worlds in which monumentality transformed human life. From the first temple platforms in Mesopotamia to Egyptian pyramids, from massive fortification walls to planned ceremonial centers, ancient people repeatedly reorganized labor, surplus, and belief into structures that exceeded the scale of any household or village. Monument building was not only artistic or devotional, it was political metabolism made visible. Stone, mud brick, timber, transport, quarrying, food rations, skilled hands, administrative oversight, coercion, prestige, all converged in built form. The monument stood because an entire society had been bent toward its making. That is why monuments appear so often in later memory as warnings. They are material concentrations of human will. Even when admired, they can feel faintly accusatory. Who carried these blocks? Who fed the laborers? Who was displaced? Which fields produced the grain that made the work possible? What kind of command could sustain such a project across years or decades? The ancient world did not always romanticize these questions. Sometimes it encoded them through tales of punished pride or broken speech. The story later known as the Tower of Babel is a clear example. In the biblical text, humanity gathers in one place and seeks to build a city and a tower reaching toward heaven, lest they be scattered. God confounds their language and disperses them. The story is theological, etiological, and richly symbolic. It addresses language diversity, human arrogance, divine sovereignty, and the problem of unity without humility. Yet it also belongs to the Mesopotamian world of ziggurats, immense temple towers rising above urban plains. Later readers often imagined the story abstractly, but its original listeners likely knew the sight of monumental sacred architecture dominating the horizon. The warning then was not delivered in a vacuum. It spoke through a recognizable built environment. Some scholars have linked aspects of the Babel tradition to Babylon itself, whose great ziggurat and imperial pretensions made it a natural symbol for concentrated power. Others emphasize the literary and theological development of the text in exilic or post-exilic contexts. The debates matter, and certainty should not be exaggerated. But even in broad outline, the pattern is striking. The city that would gather all speech into one system becomes the city where speech fractures. The project meant to prevent dispersal produces it. Human beings fear scattering, and in trying to abolish that vulnerability entirely, they create another kind of danger. A brick stamped with a ruler's name can make this feel immediate. Fired or sun-dried, mass-produced and inscribed, such bricks announce authority at the smallest unit of monumental construction. The wall does not only exist, it declares who caused it to rise. Yet when archaeologists later uncover those bricks in collapse layers or secondary use, the message changes. The king's name remains, the permanence does not. The warning is almost tender in its irony. Human beings write themselves into stone because they know time is stronger than memory. Time answers by preserving the inscription while removing the world it once governed. This pattern is not limited to the ancient Near East. Across civilizations, the more centralized and symbolically charged the built order becomes, the more it invites stories about excess, cosmic offense, or the burden placed on ordinary lives. In China, traditions about dynastic downfall often bind overreaching rule to flood control failure, labor extraction, court corruption, or the loss of heaven's favor. In Mesoamerican and Andean contexts, monumental landscapes likewise testify to social coordination on grand scales that later generations had to interpret, inherit, or stand in awe before. The exact mythic structures differ, and they should not be flattened into one universal script. But the intuition recurs. Built greatness is unstable because it compresses too much dependency into too visible a form. There is also a quieter warning inside these traditions. Human beings do not only build monuments to dominate, they build them to outlast forgetting, to make memory stand upright against erosion, to leave a sign large enough that descendants cannot miss it. Yet monuments are often the first things later peoples misunderstand. Their scale survives, their purpose blurs, new stories grow around them. The warning, therefore, doubles back on itself. Even the structure meant to defeat oblivion may become unreadable. Imagine laborers passing baskets of mud or hauling dressed stone while a supervisor counts, while priests recite, while rulers imagine legacy. None of them could see the full future of what they were making. They could not know which parts would endure, which meanings would be lost, which later generations would regard the work with reverence, resentment, confusion, or mythic fear. But perhaps some of them already sensed the tension. To build higher was also to place more faith in systems that could fail, and that may be why so many stories about towers, walls, and sacred mountains do not end in triumph. They end in dispersal, silence, or altered speech. Not because human beings should never build greatly, but because every civilization is tempted to mistake visible scale for secure order. The old myths answer with a gentler and more sorrowful correction. The greater the structure, the more carefully a people must remember the fragility beneath it, the hands that raised it, the earth that supports it, the language that binds the workers together, and the quiet possibility that one day the monument will remain while the world that understood it has gone. If monuments warn against visible excess, ancient burial places warn in a quieter register. They remind the living that every civilization is built beside its dead, and that the treatment of the dead often reveals what a people fears most about the future. Tombs, grave goods, ancestor shrines, cremation grounds, skull caches, funerary texts, offerings left in darkness, these are not only responses to mortality, they are also instructions sent forward. They tell descendants what must be remembered, what must be repaired, what dangers continue after a body has gone still. Archaeology returns to this human truth again and again. At burial sites across continents and millennia, the dead are rarely abandoned without meaning. Even where grave goods are sparse, some pattern usually remains: orientation, pigment, posture, repeated gesture, separation by age or status, evidence of revisiting, signs of care. The details vary enormously. Some communities buried with ornament, tools, food, or symbolic objects. Others favored simpler forms. Some practiced cremation, exposure, secondary burial, or skull retrieval. No single theory can explain the full range, but taken together, these practices show that human beings have long treated death not as a private ending alone, but as a dangerous threshold requiring memory, ritual, and caution. This caution enters myth in many forms. The restless dead appear when burial is denied. Ancestors protect or punish depending on how they are honored. Heroes descend to the underworld seeking knowledge and return changed. Kings attempt to secure immortality and fail. Entire landscapes become crowded with stories warning the living that forgetting the dead invites disorder. These tales are symbolic and theological, but they are also rooted in the ordinary material fact that grief must be organized. A society that cannot place its dead meaningfully is often a society in crisis. One sees this with particular force in periods of upheaval: mass graves, disrupted cemeteries, hurried burials, missing offerings, bodies left unburied after conflict. Such evidence appears in many times and places, and it always changes the moral atmosphere of the record. A normal funerary pattern suggests continuity. A broken one suggests rupture. The warning may not be written anywhere. It is visible in absence. What remains are bones out of place. What vanished is the ceremonial order that should have surrounded them. Why that matters is not only religious. Burial custom is one of the clearest ways communities express who belongs, how memory is structured, and what dignity means. Ancient Egypt understood this with exceptional intensity. Tombs were houses for eternity, but also technologies of continuity, linking body, name, offering, text, image, and cosmic order. The dead required ongoing relation. Yet even in Egypt, with all its monumental care for the afterlife, burial security was never absolute. Tomb robbery, political disruption, and changing dynasties repeatedly threatened the ideal. The lavishness of funerary preparation can therefore be read not only as confidence, but as anxiety. The more fragile the future feels, the more urgently one prepares against erasure. Mesopotamia, too, preserved a profound unease around death and remembrance. The netherworld in its literature is often shadowed and dusty, more continuity than bliss. What matters is not paradise in a later theological sense, but ongoing status through descendants, offerings, and proper rites. A dead person without descendants or ritual care risks a diminished condition. This is not merely superstition. It reflects a society in which lineage, household continuity, and intergenerational obligation were central structures of survival. The warning was simple and severe. The living owe the dead memory, because one day the debt reverses. A single healed bone can open this whole world. When osteologists identify injuries that had time to mend, they reveal that a person once survived trauma through care. Someone fed them, sheltered them, kept them alive, while their body knit slowly back together. If that same skeleton is then found in a formal burial, the continuity becomes moving. The community did not only preserve life, it preserved death with meaning. Myth grows naturally from such worlds because memory is already social at every stage. The dead do not vanish into abstraction. They remain within obligation. This is larger than it first seemed because funerary warning extends beyond mortality into civilizational self-knowledge. A people buries not only individuals, but versions of its own order. The grave records hierarchy, affection, fear, cosmology, craftsmanship, diet, disease, migration, kinship. When later generations encounter older tombs, they do not meet death in the abstract. They meet prior worlds asking to be read. Sometimes the reading is reverent. Sometimes it is exploitative. Sometimes it turns quickly into myth, because the old burial place feels too charged to leave without a story. Imagine a child taken to the edge of a cemetery at dusk, hearing that one must step carefully here, speak softly here, remember names here. The instruction might sound spiritual, but beneath it lies a durable human warning. The society that stops honoring its dead begins to lose proportion about the living as well. Ancestors in myth often punish arrogance, not because the past is jealous, but because forgetting prior suffering makes present power reckless. The tomb becomes a quiet corrective. It says, "Others stood where you stand. Others built, loved, feared, commanded, buried, and vanished. Their silence is not empty. It is a boundary." And perhaps this is why so many old stories turn burial failure into cosmic disorder. The point is not simply that ghosts are frightening. It is that memory itself becomes unstable when the chain of care breaks. The dead, after all, are the largest community any civilization will ever create. To live responsibly among them requires humility, ritual, and a willingness to accept that the future will judge the living by how they carried the fragile burden of those who could no longer speak. There are warnings that arrive only after distance has entered memory. A people leaves one land, settles another, and generations later still carries the old crossing inside its sacred language. The departure may once have been practical: drought, war, pressure from stronger neighbors, failed harvests, opportunity elsewhere. But over time, the movement becomes more than relocation. It becomes a template for how suffering is understood. Exile, wandering, promised ground, forbidden return, dangerous passage. These patterns run through ancient traditions with extraordinary persistence, as if the act of leaving one world for another marked the human imagination permanently. This is not surprising. Migration alters everything at once. Landscapes change. Ancestors remain behind or must be carried symbolically. Rivers lose their old names. Plants, animals, and weather no longer answer in familiar ways. Even those who move voluntarily must learn to read a new world fast enough to survive. Those forced into motion carry an added burden, the memory of loss without the dignity of choosing. Myths shaped in the wake of movement therefore often sound like warnings because movement itself is a warning. It teaches that no place, however beloved, is guaranteed forever. Archaeology, linguistics, and genetics have complicated the older habit of imagining ancient peoples as rooted and static. Across prehistory and history, human populations moved repeatedly, sometimes in large-scale pulses, sometimes through long, slow drift, marriage networks, trade corridors, elite expansion, pastoral mobility, colonization, or displacement. The Indo-European language family spread across immense distances through processes still debated in detail. Bantu-speaking populations expanded over centuries through diverse ecological and social pathways. Austronesian voyagers crossed extraordinary reaches of ocean, carrying crops, animals, technologies, and cosmologies into island worlds. Each case differs. None should be flattened into a single master story, yet together they reveal a basic truth. Many later traditions of belonging stand atop much older histories of movement. Myths preserve these histories obliquely. Founding ancestors emerge from caves, cross seas, survive wilderness, or receive land through covenant after long trial. Sometimes the root is historical in dim outline. Sometimes it is more symbolic than literal. Often it is both, because real migrations are quickly absorbed into moral and cosmological pattern. The warning carried forward is not only that an earlier people once wandered. It is that settlement itself must remain aware of its provisional nature. A people forgets its own migratory past at some risk. It may become arrogant toward new arrivals, or blind to the conditions that once made its own existence possible. A shoreline can hold this warning better than a chronicle. Imagine a canoe drawn up after an ocean crossing, a mooring place remembered in later ritual after the actual landing date is lost. Imagine a desert spring reached after weeks of movement, becoming sacred not because it is inherently miraculous, but because without it, a lineage would have ended. In many oral traditions, geographic features are not passive scenery, they are memory anchors. The rock where ancestors rested, the pass where enemies struck, the ford where the waters were crossed. Story attaches to terrain because terrain once decided survival. The Hebrew Bible preserves one of the most influential migration and warning complexes in human history. Exodus, wilderness, covenant, exile, return. These traditions were composed and reshaped over long periods and reflect multiple historical layers, theological aims, and communal memories. Scholars continue to debate the historical relationship between the biblical narrative and specific Late Bronze or Iron Age events. The evidence does not permit naive certainty. But whatever the precise historical core, the enduring structure is unmistakable. Liberation is followed by wandering. Possession of land is conditional. Prosperity invites forgetting. Exile becomes both punishment and memory school. The warning is not simply against enemies, it is against amnesia. Elsewhere, the pattern recurs with different emotional color. In Greek tradition, the wanderings of heroes after Troy turn victory into displacement. In Polynesian traditions, navigation and settlement encode both mastery and danger across open water. In origin, narratives from many indigenous societies, emergence or migration stories tie identity to root, testing, and placemaking rather than static possession. The specific cosmologies differ profoundly, but a common human recognition remains. To arrive somewhere is not the end of uncertainty. It is the beginning of new obligations. This is larger than it first seemed because migration myths are rarely about geography alone. They also encode the moral instability of transition. Who may join? Who must be left behind? Which gods travel? Which rites change? How long one may remain a stranger before belonging begins? These questions are not abstractions. They shape marriage, law, language, food, burial, alliance, and violence. A society that remembers having once been displaced may treat these thresholds differently, though not always more generously. Memory can humble, but it can also harden. One can imagine elders gathered around a fire in a settlement that still smells new, naming the places crossed so children will not believe this land was always theirs. Some names may already be misunderstood, some events compressed. Hardship may become miracle, confusion may become design. Yet the essential warning survives. The ground beneath you was reached through uncertainty. Others before you were made small by weather, distance, hunger, or stronger powers. Do not confuse arrival with immunity, and perhaps that is why so many ancient traditions bind movement to sacred law. The wandering people needs rules because instability frays trust. The settled people needs memory because comfort frays gratitude. Between the two lies one of myth's oldest warnings, that home is precious precisely because it is vulnerable, and that every civilization which forgets the roads, waters, deserts, and losses out of which it was formed begins quietly to endanger itself. The warning becomes still more intimate when ancient myth turns from cities, migrations, and monuments to the human body itself. For the body is where every larger catastrophe is finally registered. Flood and drought, exile and siege, labor and hierarchy, disease and grief, all of it must pass through flesh. Ancient people knew this in ways that modern abstractions sometimes hide. They watched children fail to thrive in bad years. They saw joints deform under heavy work, teeth wear down from grit in flour, bones knit crooked after injury, skin fever, lungs weaken, pregnancies fail, scars accumulate. No civilization, however grand, ever escaped the fact that its history was being carried by mortal bodies. This matters because myth often seems to speak on a cosmic scale. Gods, heavens, underworlds, kings, empires, sacred animals, world-ending water. Yet its emotional authority may come from something smaller and closer. A warning is persuasive when it can be felt. The body gives myth that force. To say that a people has broken faith, offended order, or crossed a dangerous boundary is one thing. To link that breach to plague, infertility, wasting, madness, sleeplessness, or premature death is another. Suddenly the warning enters ordinary life, where no one can remain entirely theoretical. Ancient epidemics, of course, are among the hardest events to reconstruct with precision. Written descriptions can be vivid but ambiguous. Archaeological traces are uneven. Ancient DNA has transformed parts of the field by identifying pathogens in some remains, yet the record is still partial. Even so, there is no doubt that disease repeatedly altered the human past. Dense settlement, trade routes, domesticated animals, warfare, and ecological disruption all created conditions in which infection could spread. When communities lacking modern germ theory faced sudden mortality, myth and religion naturally became central frameworks for meaning. This was not because ancient people were irrational. It was because they were trying to think at the scale of suffering available to them. The plague at Athens during the Peloponnesian War, described by Thucydides, stands at the edge of myth and analysis in a revealing way. Thucydides tries to observe carefully, refusing easy divine explanation even while reporting the collapse of social order under mass death. His account is not mythic in form, yet it shows how quickly bodies in crisis reorder a civilization's moral grammar. Burial customs break down, law weakens, despair spreads. The body becomes the place where political and cultural confidence fails. Other ancient societies preserved such breakdowns in more overtly sacred language, pestilence as divine anger, impurity, curse, or cosmic correction. The explanatory models differ, but the underlying recognition is shared. Human order is biologically, fragile. A tooth can hold that recognition in silence. Enamel defects reveal childhood stress. Isotopes suggest diet and movement. Calculus preserves traces of what was eaten and perhaps inhaled. Bone lesions may hint at chronic infection or nutritional strain. None of these signs speaks in complete sentences. The record grows thin, and interpretation must remain disciplined. Yet each small mark reminds us that the past was not made by generalized populations. It was endured by bodies under pressure. When myths warn of famine, pollution, divine anger, or cursed bloodlines, they may be translating experiences that were always, in the end, somatic. This is one reason ancient traditions so often attach moral meaning to bodily states. Purity laws, food taboos, healing sanctuaries, incubation rituals, sacred washings, protective amulets, lamentation rites, and exorcistic practices all sit near the threshold between visible and invisible harm. Modern readers can separate religion from medicine too sharply if they are not careful. In many ancient societies, bodily care, environmental caution, social boundary, and spiritual order formed one field of concern. A polluted well, a violated corpse, an unjust ruler, and a spreading sickness could be experienced as aspects of a disturbed whole. That does not mean myth-encoded microbiology in secret form. It means myth preserved a wiser intuition than it is often given credit for, that bodies register imbalances long before systems are able to explain them clearly. When enough people begin to sicken, weaken, miscarry, or die, the culture must answer not only what is happening, but what kind of world would allow it. The answer may be wrong in mechanism and still truthful in atmosphere. It may preserve, in sacred form, the feeling of living inside a breakdown whose causes exceed immediate comprehension. Imagine a mother placing a hand on a child's forehead in a room where others have already been ill. Outside, the city still stands. The temple still stands. Trade may even continue. But inside that gesture, civilization has narrowed to heat, breath, waiting, fear. Whatever story the society tells about the crisis must eventually answer to this scale. The body is where every large narrative is tested for mercy. And perhaps this is why so many ancient warnings are inseparable from ritual care. The point is not only to appease gods or repel unseen forces, it is to restore relation around vulnerable bodies, wash, isolate, mourn, abstain, offer, pray, bury, purify, remember. These acts may not always heal in the modern clinical sense, but they gather human attention around fragility. They say, do not become arrogant about survival. Do not imagine that stone walls, royal decrees, or inherited myths exempt you from the oldest condition of all. For every ancient civilization, no matter how brilliant, was only ever a temporary arrangement of breathing bodies in uncertain environments. The warning carried forward through plague tales, healing cults, cursed traditions, and body-centered rites is not only that death comes, it is that human order must remain answerable to suffering at the smallest scale, or else all its grandeur becomes strangely hollow. A myth can speak of gods and still be at heart about a trembling hand, a fevered child, a wound that will not close, and the difficult tenderness required to go on living beside such knowledge. By the time a civilization has learned to place warnings in flood, famine, monument, exile, tomb, and body, another question begins to trouble the edges of its thought. What if the deepest danger is not any one disaster, but the recurring habit of forgetting just enough to repeat the conditions that made disaster possible. Ancient myths return to this with remarkable persistence. They do not only remember rupture, they remember repetition. Ages rise and fall. Dynasties renew old failures under new names. Survivors rebuild, prosper, harden, neglect, and then stand again before some version of the same threshold. This cyclical sensibility should not be exaggerated into a universal doctrine. Not all ancient cultures imagined time as simple repetition. Many held more complex views, blending cycles with lineages, unique events, sacred interventions, or directional historical change. Still, the intuition that decline returns, that order requires renewal, and that forgetting breeds recurrence is widespread enough to matter. It appears in cosmologies, king lists, seasonal rites, purification festivals, and myths of repeated destruction. The world does not merely end once. It frays whenever human beings cease to maintain the fragile relations that hold it together. Mesoamerican traditions preserve this pattern with particular power. Later Aztec accounts, shaped through long development and post-conquest recording, speak of successive worlds or suns, each ending through different forms of destruction before the current age emerges. The details vary by source and context, and one must be careful not to flatten multiple traditions into one simple apocalyptic scheme. Yet the emotional structure is unmistakable. Human life exists within a cosmos that has failed before. The present order is real, but provisional. Continuity itself depends on vigilance, ritual, and reciprocal maintenance. South Asian traditions likewise preserve large temporal visions in which worlds emerge, endure, decline, and are remade. The Yuga system, as known from later Hindu texts and traditions, frames moral and cosmic deterioration across immense spans. These are not historical chronologies in a modern sense. They are ethical cosmological forms, yet they express a deeply human recognition. People often experience the present as diminished from a remembered or imagined earlier order. Whether the memory is literal, symbolic, or aspirational, the warning remains. Decline is easiest to see when one has inherited stories of former balance. Even in traditions less overtly cyclical, ritual practice often assumes recurrence. Fields must be blessed again, boundaries remarked, kingship relegitimated, pollution removed, ancestors fed, flood channels cleared, calendars reset. New Year ceremonies in several ancient cultures enact precisely this principle. The cosmos is not left to run indefinitely after a single good beginning. It requires periodic repair. A civilization that stops performing repair may not collapse at once, but it begins to drift toward disorder with less resistance. A repaired canal wall can say all of this without words. Silt accumulates slowly. Neglect goes unnoticed until water no longer moves as it should. Then labor must return to reopen the line between need and supply. Ancient hydraulic societies understood this with practical severity. Irrigation was not a machine one built once. It was a relation one maintained continuously. The warning encoded in many myths may work similarly. It does not preserve a frozen lesson. It preserves the need to revisit the lesson before conditions worsen again. This is larger than it first seemed because cyclical warning changes the meaning of myth itself. Myth is no longer merely a story about a past event or original age. It becomes a maintenance system for attention. A flood tale is told again, not only to honor the dead, but to keep descendants from confusing present calm with permanent safety. A kingship myth is recited not only to glorify beginnings, but to remind rulers that legitimacy decays. A seasonal descent and return is performed not only to symbolize fertility, but to train communities in patience, grief, and renewal. Some researchers, especially in the comparative study of ritual and memory, have emphasized that repetition is one of culture's primary defenses against forgetting. Others point out that repetition can also conceal change, making communities believe they have preserved continuity when the underlying conditions are already shifting. Both insights belong here. To repeat a warning is necessary. To assume repetition alone guarantees understanding is dangerous. This is why myths often retain an unsettled tone even when performed regularly. They do not let comfort become complete. Imagine villagers gathering each year for a rite whose words are old and whose necessity no one dares dismiss, though some no longer know the full origin. The children are restless. The elders are attentive. The air smells of smoke and grain and dust. Somewhere inside the chant is a memory of flood, drought, war, or covenant broken long ago. No one present witnessed it. Yet the ritual insists that forgetting would be a risk, not because the exact event will return unchanged, but because the pattern of negligence, pride, imbalance, or simple human short-sightedness always can. And perhaps this is one of the most mature insights ancient myth offers. The warning is not only about catastrophe arriving from outside, it is about the ordinary erosion of care. Channels clog, boundaries blur, duties weaken, language becomes habitual instead of alert. Prosperity numbs gratitude, power numbs proportion. Then what seemed like a sudden fall reveals itself as a long, quiet accumulation of unattended things. The old stories answer this not with despair, but with recurrence of another kind, remembrance deliberately renewed. Tell the flood again, mourn the city again, feed the dead again, mark the new year again, walk the boundary again, not because human beings are incapable of learning, but because learning itself erodes unless it is returned to the body, the calendar, and the shared voice. In that sense, myth may be less a record of ancient fear than an ancient technology for preventing attention from going entirely to sleep. By the end of all these old stories, after the waters have risen and the cities have burned, after the dead have been buried and unburied, after languages have fractured, harvests failed, kingdoms wandered, bodies weakened, and monuments outlived their makers, one quiet recognition remains. The warning was never only about disaster. It was about memory under pressure, about the difficulty of passing forward what matters before the conditions that made it legible disappear. Ancient myth, at its deepest, may not be trying to tell later generations exactly what happened. It may be trying to ensure that later generations do not become too certain that what surrounds them now is permanent, self-explanatory, or immune to loss. This is why the old narratives often leave such a lingering aftertaste. They do not behave like solved problems. Even when scholars identify a plausible environmental background, a historical crisis, or a ritual function, the story keeps some residue that exceeds reduction. A flood tale is not exhausted by sea level rise. A city lament is not exhausted by one conquest layer. A tower myth is not exhausted by an imperial ziggurat. The surplus is not error. It is the form memory takes when it must survive translation across centuries of changed language, changed institutions, changed fear. Precision may diminish, significance does not necessarily diminish with it. Modern historical method, at its best, teaches discipline in the face of this temptation. It reminds us that resemblance is not proof, that stories migrate, that symbols accumulate new meanings, that oral traditions adapt, that archaeological silence can mislead, and that not every dramatic myth conceals a datable event. That caution is necessary. Without it, one falls too easily into fantasy. Yet there is another risk on the opposite side. Treating myth as mere decorative invention once its literal details fail to align with modern standards of evidence. That approach can become its own blindness. It forgets that the ancestors were not foolish. They were often confronting instability with the tools available to them, and those tools included narrative structures powerful enough to carry warning after explanation had frayed. Perhaps that is why so many myths feel like broken vessels still wet on the inside. They may no longer hold the original event cleanly, but they retain the atmosphere of urgency. Respect the boundary. Do not trust abundance too much. Do not confuse centrality with permanence. Care for the dead. Rebuild with humility. Remember that land changes, power thins, the body fails, speech divides, and no order sustains itself without renewal. These are not childish lessons. They are among the most adult recognitions human societies ever produced. A submerged shoreline makes this plain in a final, almost painful way. Somewhere beneath present seas lie camps, paths, estuaries, fishing places, perhaps graves and shrines, once central to living worlds, and now mostly unreachable. Those people are not merely prehistoric in the abstract. They were as convinced of ordinary continuities as anyone is. The next season, the familiar crossing, the place where the children played, the stand of trees, the route home at dusk. Then, slowly or suddenly, the geography of trust altered. If they passed anything forward, it could not have been a contour map. It would have been something more durable and less exact, a story of transgression, a warning about water, a tale of a former world. The same may be said of ruined capitals, undeciphered scripts, disturbed graves, abandoned canals, and temples whose gods changed names while the stones remained. Each is a reminder that human memory is selective not only by weakness, but by necessity. No community can preserve everything. It must decide, consciously or not, what to make sacred, what to narrate, what to ritualize, what to let dissolve. Myth is one of the places where those decisions become visible. It shows not the whole past, but the parts a people feared to lose entirely. And this is larger than it first seemed because it turns the old question back toward the present with almost unbearable gentleness. What are modern societies preserving in forms strong enough to survive misunderstanding? Which losses, already underway, are being translated into story because technical language alone cannot carry their human weight? Rising seas are measured now in satellite data and tide gauges, yet they are also becoming family memory in threatened coasts. Forest loss appears in climate models, yet also in the grief of people who no longer hear species once common. War is archived in footage and state documents, yet also in the tales displaced households will tell long after strategic explanations lose their force. The divide between mythic warning and historical record may not be as absolute as modern pride prefers. None of this means that every ancient myth was a coded memory of one real catastrophe. The evidence will not bear so sweeping a claim. Some myths are primarily theological, moral, political, or cosmological. Some blend several layers too tightly ever to untangle fully. Some may preserve dim environmental or social echoes, while others work mostly through symbol. The debates remain unresolved, and they should remain open where the record is thin. But it is still possible to say something careful and true. Many ancient myths behave like warnings because the people who carried them had lived close enough to instability to know that the world does not owe human beings continuity. So the last image need not be a burning city or a drowning plane. It may be something smaller. An elder repeating a story as evening comes. A child listening without fully understanding. A stone passed through many hands. A ritual continued after its first occasion is lost. A shoreline remembered in song after it is gone from sight. That is how warning survives most deeply, not as certainty, but as a tremor preserved in culture. And perhaps that is the gentlest final truth the ancient world offers. The past does not only ask to be decoded, it asks to be listened to with proportion. Not every myth tells us what happened, but many tell us with astonishing patience what human beings felt they must not forget. That may be enough. In the dark between evidence and memory, they kept handing something onward, not a map, not a verdict, just a frail, durable instruction shaped by flood, ash, hunger, grief, and time. Live as though the world is real, precious, and breakable because it always was.